had this idea to rank every hand trap in Yu-Gi-Oh! My thinking was, hand traps have become more of a thing in the modern era. There shouldn't be that many, right? To my surprise, when I got to this subreddit, there was about 100 of them. I didn't count them, nor am I going to. So instead of that, I'm going to be ranking the top 10 hand traps. And at number 10, we have Effect Veiler. What this card does is, during your opponent's main phase, quick effect, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard. Then target one effect monster your opponent controls. Negate the effects of that face-up monster your opponent controls until the end phase of this turn. Now this card was used by Yusei Fudo to negate the effect of Lawton's Gatling Ogre, thus preventing Lawton from getting the OTK on Yusei. Outside the anime, this card has become a bit of a staple card just because of how good it is at stopping your opponent. Stopping them on their normal summon to prevent them from getting out a key combo piece from their deck, or stopping a really important effect of an extra deck monster. In either case, if they don't have any more extenders in their hand, it stops the combo on the spot. But the downside to this card is you can only use it on your opponent's main phase. Meaning, if you draw it during your turn, and your opponent has already gone full combo, you won't be able to use it until your opponent's next turn at the absolute earliest. And since most games of Yu-Gi-Oh! End by turn 3 anyways, it's essentially a dead card, and that's why it's so low on this list. At number 9 is Droll Lockbird. If a card is added from the main deck to your opponent's hand, except during the draw phase, quick effect, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard. For the rest of this turn, cards cannot be added from either player's main deck to their hand. This is one of those situationally useful cards. If your opponent is playing a deck that adds a lot of cards from the main deck to the hand, this card is really strong, and you can just send this card from your hand to the graveyard on their first add. But if your opponent is playing a deck where they only add one card, it's probably not worth running and leaving it in the side deck. Really powerful in some situations, does next to nothing in other situations. On the plus side, it's a if effect and not a when effect that lacks a once per turn. If your opponent adds a card and they immediately use another effect, you can chain to that effect to Droll Lockbird. And if your opponent has Called by the Grave, which can negate a monster in the graveyard by banishing it, you can send another Droll Lockbird, because it's not once per turn. At number 8 is Bystial Magnamhut. You can target one light or dark monster in either graveyard, finish it, and if you do, you can special summon this card from your hand. This is a quick effect if your opponent controls a monster. If this card is special summoned, you can activate this effect. During the end phase, add one dragon monster from your deck or graveyard to your hand, except for Bystial Magnamhut. You can only use each effect of Bystial Magnamhut once per turn. This card shares the same effect that the other level 6 Bystials do to banish a light or dark monster to summon itself. All the level 6s act as both interruption and as a body on board. So what sets this card above all the other Bystials? It's the fact that it can search out any dragon monster and not just a Bystial monster. Dragon League can use it to search out one of their starters. Vanquish Soul can use it to search out their main boss monster, Caesar Valius. Branded can use it to search out Fallen Albaz or Albion the Shrouded Dragon. Tenpai can use it to search out Genroku or Pydra, or any deck can use it to search out another Bystial as another interrupt, or to get rid of other problematic cards before they become a threat on your turn, like Gimmick Puppet Nightmare. Whenever light or dark monsters are predominant in the format, you can guarantee that these cards are going to be at least in the side deck, if not in the main deck. But if there's ever a format where we have mainly water or earth monsters in the meta, you can rest assured these are probably going to stay in the side deck for the most part. For the number 7 spot is Dimension Shifter. This card has the simple but powerful effect of, if you have no cards in your graveyard, quick effect. You can send this card from your hand to the graveyard. Until the end of the next turn, any card sent to the graveyard is banished instead. Released in 2019 in the Gold Sarcophagus tin, it was an immediate flop. Very few decks wanted to run it, simply because the decks at the time wanted cards in their graveyard. Sky Striker needed to recur the resources, Salamangrates needed to have their graveyard as like a second hand, basically. Forecast operates primarily in the graveyard. Thunder Dragon could have maybe used it, but not really, because they rely on getting cards to the graveyard and then banishing them. Fast forward 5 years later, and it has become a ban-worthy card for being an inclusion in decks like Flunderies, since most cards in that deck actually benefit by being banished instead of being in the graveyard. Or most recently in decks like Tenpai, where they don't need their graveyard in order to OTK you. And this card is really powerful against one of the best decks of the format, Snake Eye, Fiendsmith, Azamina. And that is a deck that requires the graveyard. Very much so requires the graveyard. And since the shifter lasts until the end of the next turn, they can just shotgun it on their turn and not have to worry about cards like Triple Tactic Thrust on their opponent's turn. The shifter has only gotten better with time as more decks like Malice coming up in crossover breakers are becoming less reliant on the graveyard. And they even benefit by being banished instead. And at number 6 is Dominus Impulse. If your opponent controls a card, you can activate this card from your hand. When a card or effect is activated that includes an effect to special summon a monster, negate that effect. Then if you have a trap in your graveyard, destroy that card. If you activate this card from your hand, you cannot activate the effects of light, earth, and wind monsters for the rest of this duel. You can only activate one Dominus Impulse per turn. On paper, it's almost like a worse Solemn Warning, and it doesn't even include normal summons like Warning does. And it's not even a counter trap card. That would be true if you couldn't activate this card from your hand as long as your opponent controls a card. And since most of the time a card that would special summon a monster is a card on the field, it's almost always going to be live, whether you're chaining to your opponent's Branded Fusion, Sengen Kaiman, or Snake Eye Ash. The only trade-off is that you can't activate light, earth, or wind monsters for the rest of the duel. But since dark monsters are the most supported monster attribute in the entire game, decks like Labyrinth and Dynamorphia can ignore this cost entirely. At number 5 is Mulcharmy Fuwalos. If you control no cards, quick effect, you can discard this card. Each time your opponent special summons a monster, Earth, from the deck and or extra deck, immediately draw one card. Once during this end phase, if the number of cards in your hand is more than the number of cards your opponent controls, plus 6, you must randomly shuffle cards from your hand into the deck so the number in your hand equals the number your opponent controls plus 6. You can only activate one other Mulcharmy effect the turn you activate this effect. That was kind of weird to read. On paper, this seems like Maxx, but with a cost. If your opponent has 5 cards during the end phase, and you have 15 cards in your hand, you'd have to shuffle randomly 4 cards so you have 11 cards in your hand. That's kind of a little broken on its own. But here's the overall catch to this. If your opponent is using Fuwalos, there's a good chance they're also using other hand traps. So they can offset the cost by using other hand traps and not even worry about the shuffle back. What makes this card even stronger is it's not once per turn for its own effect. So if you draw into another one, you can immediately activate it. You just can't activate another Mulcharmy. Or if you have 2 in hand, you can activate one, your opponent ashes it, you can immediately use the other one. So your opponent has the option to go full combo, knowing full well that they could be interrupted again, or set up a minimalistic board that may just be broken anyways. At the number 4 slot is Nibiru the Primal Being. During the main phase, if your opponent normal or special summoned 5 or more monsters this turn, quick effect, you contribute as many face-up monsters on the field as possible. And if you do, special summon this card from your hand, then special summon one Primal Being token, rock, light, level 11, attack question, defense question to your opponent's field. This token's attack defense becomes the combined original attack defense of the tributed monsters. You can only use this effect of Nibiru the Primal Being once per turn. Released in 2018, the same tin that D-Shifter was released in, and right in the middle of TOS format, this card immediately changed how people played the game, making players cautious about committing 5 summons on the chance that their opponent has a Nibiru in their hand and losing their entire board. This devastated decks like Salamangreat and Orchest, which more often than not had to commit 5 summons to get their plays going. Since its release, players have been committing a card to counter Nibiru either before or on their 5th summon. At number 3 is Infinite Impermanence. Target one face-up monster your opponent controls. Negate its effects until the end of this turn. Then, if this card was set before activation and is on field at resolution, for the rest of this turn, all other spell trap effects in this column are negated. If you control no cards, you can activate this card from your hand. This card is an upgraded version of Effect Veiler, but instead of being restricted to your opponent's main phase, the restriction is you can't control cards, meaning you can activate it on your turn as well to negate the effects of a particularly problematic monster like number 41, Boguska the Terribly Tired Taper, Thunder Dragon Colossus, or Kokimaru Drago. If you do control cards, you can still set this card as a normal trap, and it even gets a bonus to negate all other cards in the spell trap card zones in the same column, and thus making your opponent think twice before activating a card in the same column as one of your set cards. Cards like Nibiru and Infinite Impermanence have forever changed how people play the game, being extra cautious how or where they play their cards. At the number 2 slot is Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. When a card or effect is activated that includes any of these effects, quick effect this card, negate that effect. Add cards from the deck to the hand, special summon a monster cards from the deck, send a cards from the deck to the graveyard. You can only use this effect of Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring once per turn. Ever since the release of Maximum Crisis in 2017, Ash Blossom has been a staple in the meta game. Being able to stop your opponents from searching out a key combo piece is devastating. Or when your opponent activates a Pot of Desires and banishes the top 10 cards of their deck face down to draw 2, and then you chain Ash Blossom. That is kind of devastating, to just deny your opponent that resource and for your opponent to get rid of a quarter of their deck. For a more modern example, stopping a branded fusion from resolving, and thus preventing them from going full branded combo. And since Ash negates effect and not activation, they are unable to activate another one if they can retrieve it from the graveyard somehow, since branded is limited at the time of recording this video. While cards like Dominus Impulse and Droll and Lockbird are technically more powerful, Ash Blossom is usable universally and is usually not format dependent. No matter which format you're in, there's a good chance that Ash Blossom is going to be there because of how good Ash is since its introduction to the game. And number 1 is Maxx. Quick effect. You can send this card from your hand to the graveyard. This turn, each time your opponent special summons a monster, immediately draw 1 card. You only use this effect of Maxx once per turn. Because of how much the modern game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Revolves around how many cards you can special summon in a turn, this card single-handedly warps formats around it. If your opponent drops a Maxx, you're put into a position where you have to consider how much you can commit to the board to give your opponent as little cards as possible. Or you just end your turn, and your opponent has no draws from the Maxx effect, and you just kind of hope they can't kill you. Maxx has recently been semi-limited in the OCG and has been banned in the TCG since 2018. Because of the 2 formats being defined by whether or not Maxx has been legal, certain decks like Dragon Link and Runic Synchro have been able to thrive in the TCG and found their place here, while the decks were never even considered in the OCG because of how many times they special summon and just play into Maxx. Ash Blossom has never been on the ban list in the TCG, but in OCG, from April 2018 to April 2020, OCG had it semi-limited. because of how good it was at countering Maxx. And that's the list. If there's anything I may have missed or something that should have been here instead, let me know down below. And while you're down there, subscribe to the channel. My name is Vincent. Goodbye.